any case, we're very happy to have with us today Yasser Khan, who is an assistant professor in the Department of English Literature and Linguistics at Qatar University, and he was the recipient of the 2024 BAR's President's Fellowship for work which he's going to be talking about now. His work on theatricality and performance of race and empire in the long 18th century explores the convergence of critical race theory, performance, and race studies. His recent publications include The Racecraft of Romantic Stagecraft in the Cambridge Companion to Romanticism and Race, which came out last year, Variant Rebellions, Psychic Compromise in Obi or Three-Fingered Jack, which was in the 18th century theory and interpretation, and Theorizing the Performance and Blackness for Studies in Romanticism. You can see his title for today on the slide here. It's an extremely attractive slide. I must say, Tippoo Saib, Astley's Amphitheatre, exploring the scenic atmosphere of theatrical Orientalism. So we'll have the talk, and I would ask you to keep your cameras off and your microphones muted during the talk, which helps with the Zoom bandwidth. And then after the talk, Yasser has very kindly agreed to take questions if you have those. So the talk will be 40 to 45 minutes, and we'll have plenty of time afterwards for questions and discussion. So thanks very much for joining us, and take it away when you're ready.
Great. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone, or I'm sure everyone is in different time zones. Thank you for being here. Just a quick note before I begin. The talk is based on ongoing research, and some of the material is still in development. I'm really looking forward to any feedback, but please treat it as a work in progress. I'll be shaping it into a publication soon, so feel free to reach out if you'd like to discuss any part of it further. I think I should begin with I'm deeply grateful to the British Association for Romantic Studies, not only for the opportunity to share my research, but more sincerely for awarding me the 2024 BAR's President's Fellowship, which gave me both the encouragement and the means to carry out the means to carry out the archival research that made this project possible. Today, I want to take you to a rather unusual side of empire, the sawdust-strewn ring and illusionistic stage of Astley's Amphitheatre in late 18th century London. My focus is on how military spectacles inspired by the Anglo-Mysore wars, particularly those involving Tipu Sultan, were staged at Astley's. These spectacles were far more than patriotic entertainments. They constituted immersive, embodied, and affective experiences through which empire was not merely seen, but viscerally felt. Astley's began as a horse riding school, evolving into a public venue, renowned for its astonishing equestrian acrobatics. By the 1780s, under the direction of Philip Astley, a former sergeant major, the venue was enclosed to become the first circus of its kind. It offered a vibrant array of entertainments, hippodramas, equestrian, military displays, pantomimes, clowning, juggling, trick riding, and more. In doing so, it competed with London's royal patent theatres like Drury Lane and Covent Garden, becoming part of the city's rapidly expanding entertainment culture. In this talk, I propose that we rethink Orientalism beyond the textual and visual archive critique by Edward Said. At Astley's, the Orientalist spectacle was not a static image, but a kinetic, atmospheric world. The Tipu productions at Astley's exemplify a form of theatrical Orientalism shaped by space, scenography, and affect. These performances demonstrate how imperial power could be staged, not only through narrative and representation, but through the very geometry and affective environment of performance. My aim is to identify and examine the performative dynamics at work in Astley's representations of the Anglo-Mysore wars. Performative dynamics at work are dynamics that contributed to the projection of British imperial authority, while simultaneously generating moments of ambiguity and disruption within the dominant Orientalist frame. Now, this approach raises three central methodological challenges. First, how do we interpret non-discursive performances when only fragmentary textual traces remain? Second, how do we reconstruct a theatrical space that no longer exists? And third, why should such a reconstruction even matter? What is its critical yield? To address the first challenge, We need to read beyond what remains in playbills, reviews, and visual ephemera. We must reconstruct not just the look, but the feel of performance, its phenomenological contours, its spatial and affective affordances. In this slide, I highlight but some of the atmospheric elements that can be explored to construct the affective architecture of the performance. But this brings us directly to the second challenge, how to reconstruct a lost space. This is where critical imagination plays a vital role. By combining visual archives, where am I? Sorry. By combining archival sources with technologies like AI and 3D modeling, and supplementing them with informed speculation, we can begin to visualize the performances at Astley's in ways that are suggestive, if not definitive. The critic must abandon the grounded footing of the historian and adopt the more delicate posture of the dancer, tiptoeing and leaping to and fro, pegging together non-contiguous scraps of extant textual, visual, and material culture to fill in evidentiary gaps. In my analysis of the Tipu productions at Astley's, I adopt this method to highlight three key aspects of theatrical performance. Performative geometry. This refers to how performers, or in more abstract terms, bodies, animate or inanimate, interact with architectural space, how these movements bring a space to life and give it meaning. 2, logic of visualization. This concerns how perspective, angles, and sightlines govern visibility, how staging decisions direct the audience's gaze, making the viewer an active part of the stage design, and influencing the underlying power dynamics of what's in focus and what's pushed to the background. 3rd, narrative identity of spaces. This aspect tracks how spatial storytelling unfolds through bodily movement. The way bodies traverse and occupy space generates a narrative logic, revealing the political and rhetorical significance embedded in the performance environment. The goal is not a perfect reconstruction, that's an impossible task, but rather a critical remediation of performance. And as in all remediations, some things are lost, some things are gained. But the losses, as much as the gains, are nonetheless suggestive and significant, and that is its critical yield. To understand what is at stake in these performances, we must begin by situating the Tipu productions within their broader historical and theatrical context. During the 1790s, as the French Revolution gave way to the Revolutionary Wars, censorship increasingly restricted how the legitimate theaters could respond to unfolding political events. In contrast, minor theaters like Astley's, unbound by such dramatic limitations, transformed war into a visual spectacle. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the global dimensions of that war played out in India. There, the British and the French continued their imperial rivalry as an extension of the 7 Years' War, each vying for influence among northern and southern princely states. Although the British consolidated their position in Bengal, they suffered repeated defeats in the south at the hands of the formidable Mysorean alliance by Hyder Ali and his son, Tipu Sultan, during the First and Second Anglo-Mysore Wars. The tide turned with the appointment of Lord Cornwallis as commander-in-chief in 1786, leading to British victory in the Third Anglo-Mysore War and the Treaty of Seringapatam in 1792. By 1799, the conflict culminated in Tipu's death during the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War and the fall of his capital. Now, even during his lifetime, Tipu Sultan had become a notorious figure in Britain. British captives taken during the defeat at Polilur in 1780 wrote numerous captivity narratives that shaped public perception, casting Tipu as both a dangerous enemy and a compelling figure of Oriental despotism. As reports from the Mysore campaigns filtered into London, Astley's Amphitheatre capitalized on the dramatic potential of British resilience against a formidable Oriental foe. There are 3 documented performances featuring Tipu Sultan. First, the Siege of Bangalore in early 1792, Then you have Tippoo Sahib's two sons later in the year, 1792, and then the Siege of Seringapatam, 1800s. In staging these colonial conflicts, Astley's amphitheatre became more than a venue of equestrian spectacles. It became a gateway to empire that brought the colony into close visual proximity to the metropole. Now, for many spectators with limited visual means of encountering the exploits of the empire abroad, these performances played a pivotal role in shaping British perceptions of empire and the Orient. By dramatizing colonial Orientalist narratives, Astley's not only disseminated imperial ideology, but also subtly reconfigured it, blending spectacle with nationalist sentiment in ways that could reinforce, complicate, and even inadvertently subvert Orientalist narratives. What precisely do we mean by theatrical Orientalism in this context? Now, the conventional Saidian model defines Orientalism as a functional discourse that bestows the power of representation to the West. And in such a representative scheme, everything becomes indicative of the supremacy of the West, while reducing the Orient to a silent, exotic image. Now, this understanding of Orientalism is based primarily on textual, visual representations of the other in elite paintings, the human sciences, and literature. But if we look at drama, what we get is a more dynamic ideological space of contestation in which the other has to be embodied and contextualized, has to be configured and composed in a setting, has to speak and act and move. This coming alive of the other as a being in the theatrical world disrupts the signals of ideological Orientalism emitted by a performance. In other words, the phenomenological experience of such performances, the feelings evoked by the atmosphere of a performance, cultivates a culture of spectatorship that unsettles the otherwise stable, significative understanding of Oriental discourse, just as ripples in a pond distort one's reflected image. By orienting space, reorienting time and space, by making present the empire on the metropolitan stage, these performances disrupted the presumed authority of textual Orientalism with the immediacy of sensory experience. They generated what we might call affective atmospheres, immersive emotional environments that shaped how audiences felt empire. Now, drawing on Sara Ahmed's The Politics of Emotions, we can understand these affective environments as relational fields in which emotions circulate between bodies and objects, aligning spectators into shared emotional configurations. Emotions in this framework do not simply arise from within. They move, attach, detach, and produce social orientations. In the case of—
Sorry to interrupt you, Yasser. Your slides are no longer showing on the screen. Would you mind resharing your screen? Thank you.
Right, I'll do that. Is that okay?
Absolutely perfect.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So emotions in this framework do not simply arise from within. They move, attach, detach, and produce social orientations. In the case of Astley's Tipu plays, the emotions evoked, whether awe, fear, patriotism, or triumph, help script the audience's identity as British subjects. Through attachment to British power and detachment from the Oriental other, spectators are interpolated into the imperial narrative. Consider the playbill for September 18, 1792, which offers a glimpse into a typical evening at Astley's Amphitheatre. I've given the script on the left side. An assemblage of spectacle, military pageantry, and pantomime. That night's program included an East Indian military divertisement, Tipu's Two Sons, a new musical piece titled Backshot Heath Camp, and a pantomime set in Ireland, Harlequin in Ireland. In at least the first two, a military parade was staged. Bagshot Heath refers to a real military encampment in Surrey, one of the several sites across southern England used for British Army drills during the 1790s in preparation for possible war with revolutionary France. The segment evokes a mock camp environment, foot and horseback, implying infantry formations and equestrian displays, aimed at showcasing British military discipline and power for a domestic audience, thereby aligning the home front with the imperial project. Meanwhile, Harlequin in Ireland juxtaposes mythological fantasy, Apollo and Daphne, with a picturesque travelogue through Irish landscapes. The playbill lists iconic natural sites, the cataracts, Giant's Causeway, and the lakes of Killarney, locations celebrated for their sublime beauty. Now, these scenes frame Ireland as a land of enchantment, but also subtly recast it as a colonial possession that has been tamed and domesticated through theatrical spectacle. Across this single evening, spectators were invited to experience the spatial sweep of empire, a moment from the Indian campaign featuring the reception of the royal hostages, followed by a local military parade, and a scenic tour through Ireland. The triangular linkage, Bagshot Heath, India, and Ireland, functions as a visual and emotional continuum, reinforcing the idea that military triumph abroad in India is a product of the same discipline displayed at home in Bagshot Heath. Ireland, by contrast, is rendered through pastoral comedy and myth, its political tensions muted, though these tensions would erupt within a few years during the United Irishmen's Rebellion in 1798. What unifies these disparate pieces is a theatrical logic that blends myth, comedy, and military spectacle to foster British nationalism while entertaining audiences with visual effects and familiar narratives. Despite individual variations among spectators, the cultural politics of emotion work to orient them collectively, fostering attachment to British military prowess and imperial identity, and detachment from figures like Tipu Sultan, cast as the Oriental other. The position of the Irish, however, is more complex. As Daniel O'Quinn has shown in his commentary on the musical interlude in the Tippoo Saib performances, Irish soldiers typified in figures like Patrick O'Connor and Dennis O'Neill were partially assimilated through their investment in the imperial narrative. This is a song from one of the Tipu productions. And you can see in the fourth stanza, "O England and Ireland, my jewel forever," even as they were comically distanced, which blurred the lines between assimilation and subjugation. Still, while the binary between British self and Oriental other is reinforced through repeated performance, it is also continuously undermined by the very nature of theatrical form, which oscillates between reification and performance. Reification freezes action into images, gestures, tableau, character types, essentializing identity and fixing meaning. Performance, conversely, foregrounds movement, change, transformation, revealing the constructedness behind reified forms. These processes are not oppositional but mutually constitutive. Reification depends on repetition, yet each iteration introduces subtle variations that can fracture the solidity of the image, exposing it as a veneer. Thus, rather than a static ideological message, what emerges is a shifting field of emotional intensities, attachments, and detachments that fluctuate as bodies move across the stage, drawing closer to or further from the audience. The spectator's experience of empire becomes both affective and unstable, reinforcing colonial binaries even as it is occasionally unsettling them. This tension is especially vivid when we consider the spatial configuration of Astley's amphitheatre itself, where proximity, movement, and spectacle conspire to produce a deeply felt, if unstable, imperial imaginary. Astley's amphitheatre featured a distinctive architectural layout, a circular ring designed for equestrian and acrobatic feats, and a cubical proscenium stage used for dramatic representation. Now, this spatial duality is not merely architectural, it is conceptual, performative, and ideological. It underpins the theater's unique phenomenology and informs how spectacle, narrative, and sensation intersected in its productions. Now, the 3D models here presented here, though still a work in progress, are based on extant visual records of Astley's interior from various periods. Even at this preliminary stage, they reveal a bifurcated performance logic, one centered in the ring, the other on the stage. In the first circus of its kind, as the first circus of its kind, Astley's embodied a fundamental binary between the ring, where actions were performed for real, and the stage, where illusion was constructed through dramatic representation. The oscillation between the materiality of the ring and the illusionism of the stage shapes how audiences experience performance at Astley's. The ring operates according to a logic of being in the world, immersive, participatory, and embodied. During the Royal Grove period, which is from 1786 to 91, before it was burnt down, painted trees were encircled the auditorium, collapsing the divide between performance and spectator, suggesting a shared pastoral environment that drew the audience into the performance space. The ring enacts a carnivalesque logic, ritualized repetition, physicality, and collective affect. In contrast, the cubical stage adheres to the Cartesian logic of visual containment. It presents the world from a frontal perspective, relying on artificial depth, foreshortening, and representational narrative. Emerging from Renaissance stage design, it structures vision around fixed vantage points and creates dramatic distance, requiring audiences to watch from the outside, engaging with illusion, plot, and character. Now, to capture the atmosphere of attending Astley's, we can turn to Charles Dickens' Sketches by Boz, which describes the amphitheatre rebuilt after the 1803 fire. Dickens offers more than nostalgic recollection. He provides a phenomenological account of theatrical experience. Astley's, he writes, recalls so strongly our recollections of childhood, not because of novelty, but due to its comforting repetition. Quote, the clown's jokes were the same, the riding masters equally grand, the tragedians equally hoarse. A little later on, Dickens devotes an extraordinary amount of detail, not to the performers, but to the audience. He lovingly documents their ritual of settling in, removing shawls, adjusting bows, swapping seats. The children debate theatre sizes. The teenager, George, is mortified to be associated with his kin. It's a tableau of bourgeois domesticity, rendered with a warm, ironic eye. Here, Astley is not just a theatre, but a place of social display, where families become their own form of drama, observed as keenly as the action on stage. When the equestrian acts begin, the affective energy shifts. Children's delight becomes contagious. Even the father abandons decorum to join in applause. The circus acts generate a democratizing joy, bridging generational divides, dissolving hierarchies, transforming spectators into participants. The circular ring, with its ritualistic familiarity and physical immediacy, becomes a shared space of collective sensation. Dickens describes Astley's amphitheatre as a dual structure, the stage as a space of representation and meaning, and the circle as a site of presence and sensation. Each offers a different way of being in the theatre, one aligned with narrative reason, and the other with embodied feeling. And together they chart a phenomenology of performance that is unique to Astley's. The stage functions as a space of narrative immersion. It invites the audience to observe dramatic worlds unfolding behind the fourth wall. It is a space of distance and representation, where emotional engagement is filtered through character, plot, and symbolic meaning. Social recognition of both actors and fellow spectators is embedded in this space. The circle, by contrast, is a space of immediacy. It operates through repetition and ritual, where the same physical routines, clowning, riding, tumbling, gain vitality through iteration. These acts are corporeal and kinetic, what Jane Moody calls a corporal dramaturgy. The circle produces collective sensation, a shared affective response that binds the audience through laughter, thrill, and awe. Its spatial intimacy with spectators encircling the performers collapses boundary between observer and participant. This spatial duality, narrative distance versus embodied presence, defines the performance logic of Astley's. It allows for a dynamic slippage between illusion and immersion, between empire as representation and empire as sensation. Understanding this oscillation is essential to interpreting how Astley staged its military spectacles, including the Tipu productions. And it is to these productions that we turn to now to explore how these spatial logics were mobilized in the theatrical construction of imperial affect. At first, the first Astley production, The Siege of Bangalore, was put up in April 1792, which was loosely based on reports coming from India of a renewed conflict between Tipu Sultan and the East India Company, which had employed the services of Lord Cornwallis as Governor-General and Commander-in-Chief. After the successful siege of Bangalore, Tipu sued for peace, and the terms of which required the delivery of his two sons as hostages to Cornwallis until Tipu could pay the company off for punitive damages. The news of this remarkable arrangement occasioned the second Astley production in August 1792 on the departure and reception of Tipu's two sons. It is this mix of military engagement and diplomatic tact that serve as the subject for the first two productions at Astley's. While the ultimate triumph over Tipu in the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War in 1799 serves as the context for the third, the siege and storming of Seringapatam. As pointed out previously, in Astley's, we not only have a proscenium-framed stage, but also a circus ring. And the affordance that this combination of performance spaces allows for is the spilling over of the illusion onto the circus ring. The Siege of Bangalore in the first Astley production and the Siege of Seringapatam in the third Astley production can be visualized by pegging the image of the advertisement of the Battle of Alma, which indicates to some extent how these grand military spectacles might have been staged. Now, the Battle of Alma took place in 1854 during the Crimean War. And what the image shows is that Russians had occupied the heights above the river Alma, which was a strong defensive position, which the British and the Allies had to overcome through a frontal assault. The movement from the arena, the circular arena, to the sloping heights of the stage recreates the uphill battle and positions the spectators on the side of the British forces. What we get is a brilliant image demonstrating this overflow of martial spectacle from the depths of the illusionistic stage to an immersive arena of participative combat. Using the circus as a stage allowed for mass movement, horse and foot coordination, and dynamic crowd choreography, approximating the chaos of actual battle more closely than traditional stagecraft allowed. A form of spatial realism in staging battles was inaugurated through this combination of the stage and the arena. The smoke, the rising sawdust, obscures theatrical barriers, blurring not just the boundary between the stage and the arena, but also between the actors and the spectators, such that you are no longer viewing, but participating in the battle. While one reviewer remarks that the sloping platform to connect the stage and the circle was first used at Astley's for the performance of the Battle of Alma, which is in 1854, I don't think that is quite accurate. In the memoirs of John de Castro, there is evidence that such a sloping platform was used as early as 1790 for the comic pantomime The Four Quarters of the World. Quote, a platform was laid from the stage over the orchestra and round the circle up again onto the stage for the last scene of the piece, which ended up in a procession of Europe, Asia, and Africa, and America, drawn by horses, leopards, tigers, etc., which had a very grand, sublime, and imposing effect. In fact, this comic opera, The Four Quarters of the World, had been, comic pantomime, sorry, The Four Quarters of the World had been performed in 1791, just a few months before the first production of the Siege of Bangalore. There is also an undated image, Pony Race at Astley's Amphitheatre, which shows just such a platform. From the dress styles, the tricorn hats, high waist gowns, we can temporarily bracket this image between the late 18th to early 19th century. The typographic detail using serif typeface is also consistent with the type of font in use around 1780 to 1820. Based on these tangential pieces of evidence, it is not difficult to imagine that the sloping heights of Alma represented in this image through stage scenery could be substituted by a large painted backdrop of the fort cities of Bangalore or Seringapatam, creating the illusion of a formidable fortress that is being laid siege by the British forces, with the spectators viewing the war spectacle from the point of view of the charging British sepoys. In fact, the third Astley production, The Siege and Storming of Seringapatam, theatricalized just such an image that was already attracting vast crowds at the Lyceum on the Strand. Robert Kerr Porter's panoramic display of the fall of Tipu's Seringapatam was a massive scenic painting, standing at 120 feet and more than 2,500 square feet on a cylindrical canvas, being displayed around the same time as the Astley production. The panorama was a new technique of display and serves here as another peg to hold in place the atmospheric experience of viewing a scene within a geometrical cylindrical space, once again emphasizing the performative geometry of the circle. The actor and manager, Thomas Dibdin, recalled the effect of Porter's panorama on the viewers. The learned were amazed, and the unlearned were enraptured. It was as a thing dropped down from the clouds, all fire, energy, intelligence, and animation. You looked a second time. The figures moved and were commingled in a hot and bloody fight. You saw the flash of the cannon, the glitter of the bayonet, the gleam of the falchion. You longed to be leaping from crag to crag with Sir David Baird, who is hallowing his men on to victory. Then again, you seemed to be listening to the groans of the wounded and the dying, and more than one female was carried out swooning. Now, from Dibdin's account, what we get is a sense of immediacy and dynamism typical of panoramic display, a circular panoptical space that converges around a center point, the place occupied by the viewer. Dibdin's description seems to imply that the visual immersion in the panorama recreated the atmosphere of the battle, even its temperature, energy, sounds, and emotional longings and experiences of pain. The viewers are surrounded by the image and are taken in by the flow of the narrative, which is established by their shifting viewpoint. Looking ahead, you see General Baird, who is given compositional centrality in the panorama. But turning your head to the left of center, and there you see Tipu and his sons on the rampart, just before their inevitable fall to death. And if you shift your glance further to the left or right, you witness several British martyrs and other elements of the battle. Now, much can be said about the compositional decentering of Tipu, a decentering reinforced by the detailed descriptive sketch of the panorama identifying key dramatic moments. However, I want to peg this panoramic display laterally to the Tipu productions at Astley's, which created a similarly immersive experience of war, but through an inverse centering of the collective spectatorial gaze from the periphery towards the center of the circle. And it is this union of sightlines converging in the circular arena that generates the phantasmic identification with the imperial project within the metropolitan space. Astley's spectacle, like Porter's panorama, shifted attention away from singular actors, drawing attention to the atmosphere of a battlefield, engineered, like the Battle of Alma, as an overflowing, immersive experience, engulfing the spectator as a witness and participant in the bloody war rather than as a distant observer. Having established the distinct affordances of the circus ring and the proscenium stage, we can more clearly understand how movement between these spatial forms, whether from the stage to the ring or the ring to the stage, can generate atmospheric effects such as density, orientation, visibility, and energy. Consider Tipu's Two Sons, which premiered at Astley's on 20th August 1792. The play was structured in three parts. The first presented a spectacular scene of Seringapatam, in front of which unfolded the affecting, pleasing, and interesting departure of Tipu's two sons from their father. The second shifted to a view of the hill fort, staging the noble reception experienced by the Indian princes on their delivery to the commander-in-chief. The third concluded with an Oriental military festival, which took place on the occasion. Now, how might these three parts have been staged? The political significance of the background in both the first and the second scenes invites speculation on the compositional strategies involved. Now, one way to reconstruct them is again through lateral comparison with contemporary visual culture, by pegging the paintings of Bostonian painter artist Mather Brown. In mid-November 1792, Brown exhibited two paintings in London on the same themes of departure and reception of the child hostages. Although there is no evidence that Brown saw the production at Astley's, the thematic alignment emerging only months after the stage performance is suggestive enough to warrant a comparative reading. Brown's paintings employ a horizontal composition. In the first painting, the princes move leftward toward the elephants, while the women, presumably from the harem, bid them farewell from the right. In the second, it is suggested that the princes enter from the left, this time approaching Cornwallis, positioned to the right. In Astley's staging, I conjecture that these horizontal movements would be translated into spatial transitions between the cubical stage and the circular ring. The cubical stage, in terms of spatial logic, produces distance. It frames India as an exotic, aestheticized object to be visually consumed. In this setup, the emotional departure of Tipu's sons, as described by the playbills and reviews, unfolds before a painted backdrop of the gates of Seringapatam, creating an affective distance that contains metropolitan sympathy behind a proscenium-arched fourth wall. The distancing functions ideologically. The stage contains both the poignancy of departure and the glorification of the prince's reception by Cornwallis, both framed as events occurring elsewhere. Yet the staging also disrupts this containment. When the princes leave the cubical stage and enter the arena, emotional energy disperses across the space, enveloping the audience. When they move back toward the stage, now transformed into the hill fort, the same energy is reconcentrated in Cornwallis's paternal welcome. This spatial choreography modulates affect through movement. If we consider the stage as a grid, each spatial position becomes legible within culturally coded play of oppositions. Tipu and Cornwallis are staged at opposite ends, anchoring a narrative of transition from old order to new, from father to substitute father, from Mysorean sovereignty to British rule. Their bodies become sites for ideological inscription. Tyranny versus benevolence, embodied through costuming, gesture, and placement. This oppositional coding enacts the ideological agenda of Astley's production to depict the culmination of the Third Anglo-Mysore War as the replacement of despotic Eastern rule with enlightened British paternalism. However, this positional reading of the performance risks obscuring its dynamism. By focusing solely on fixed positions, Tipu replaced by Cornwallis, Muslim rule by British sovereignty, it reduces performance to an ideological tableau. Movement becomes secondary, a mere transition between predetermined points. The cubical stage, while ideal for representing static scenes and emplotting bodies in legible formations, encourages critics and reviewers to isolate such moments for retrospective commentary. These textual traces in newspapers and reviews fix performance into discrete moments or points, reflecting a tendency reinforced by Orientalist discourse to arrest meaning and essentialize signs in the archival record. Orientalism thrives in art forms that emphasize fixity, texts, paintings, but encounters resistance in dynamic forms like theater, where transformation, process, and transition dominate. Reading the performance through movement and activity, especially within the circular arena, opens up a different spatial logic. As mentioned earlier, theater enacts both tendencies simultaneously. It arrests and transforms, reifies and becomes. To privilege movement is to center performance as process. While static positions may define identity post hoc, movement precedes these identities and opens the body to transition and transformation. The bodies of the young princes, as they move across spaces, momentarily evade ideological fixing. Their motion disrupts oppositional binaries, positioning them not as passive signifiers of conquest, but as active nodes in an affective economy. Within this logic, Tipu and Cornwallis, rather than representing oppositional extremes, become fixed points on the stage that overlap or fold into each other, like two ends of a sheet of paper touching when folded in half. While Brown's paintings align with a Saidian logic, reading Tipu Sultan as an ineffectual Eastern father, Cornwallis as a benevolent Western patriarch, the stage production complicates this reading. By situating Tipu and Cornwallis in equivalent positions, it draws an unsettling parallel between them, linking both to forms of despotic power, emerging, a reading made even more plausible by the contemporary impeachment of Warren Hastings, which cast a shadow over British imperial virtue. Against these fixed, distanced positional figures, it is the princes who invite identification. In the first part, they walk onto the arena from the stage, moving toward the audience, evoking proximal attachment. In the second part, they return from the arena to the stage, departing away from the audience. This repeated staging of departure becomes doubly affective. Now the audience is asked to experience the loss of the children as their own. The playbill describes it as an affecting, pleasing departure, signaling a sentimental tone not unlike the one Edmund Burke invoked for the Begums of Awadh. The princes become sites of proximal identification, producing emotional resonance that exceeds the staged imperial allegory. Now, these effects suggest what Nicholas Mirzoeff terms counter-visuality, a visual dissensus that unsettles dominant regimes of seeing. While Astley's spectacle undoubtedly aimed to glorify British conquest, evident in its recurring productions of military spectacles, the embodiment of Oriental figures on stage resists easy incorporation into Orientalist ideology. Unlike signs and symbols, atmosphere and affect cannot be tightly regulated and disciplined. To manage the disruptive potential of this affective economy, conditioned by the performative geometry of the venue and the narrative identity of spaces, the third act of the play typically concludes with a climactic spectacle, a festival, a siege, or a conflagration. This final scene releases the accumulated emotional energy into a grand display that engulfs stage and ring, actor and spectator, metropole and colony, into one phantasmatic union, staging the ultimate imperial fantasy, represented by the image on the ceiling of the amphitheatre of Britannia receiving tributes from the four corners of the globe. In this presentation, critical analysis itself is reimagined as performative rather than merely intellectual. By using scenography, by using scenography, reconstructing spatial relations, and by creative redeployment of visual traces like advertisements and panoramas, the idea of criticism as final judgment is resisted and is instead framed as a creative act in its own right, one that exists in dialogue with the performance it addresses. Approaches to performance in its relation to language are incomplete if they operate only on the semantic and semiotic level. Tipu plays and other non-linguistic forms of entertainments that leave behind little textual traces demand to be treated, analyzed in a different way. This requires a move away from semiotics and towards sensation, embodiment, and performative geometry. Movement matters as much as, or perhaps more than, static positions. Affect exceeds or overpowers image in live performance, though it is the image or the performance reduced to a point in textual description which survives in the archives, while the original dynamic performance is lost. I believe that those of us engaged in Romantic period drama make an effort to restore past performances to a kind of presence that makes them critically fruitful. Critical analysis itself becomes a creative remediation of live performance, an interpretive dance with one foot lightly touching the historical past, while the other is extended into the future in the dynamic posture of a dancer just about to leap forward. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was a wonderful presentation and really rich and enjoyable. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions. Should we stop the slide share so that we can see people?
Yes. Should I stop sharing?
Yeah, that's good. Does anyone have immediate questions or responses or thoughts? You can raise your hand, you can type in the chat, you can unmute and speak as you prefer. Devon, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Yasser. That was really wonderful. I love Astley's. It's such a fascinating topic. I have maybe a question that's too obvious, but do we know who played the young princes in Astley's performance, and maybe how their bodies factor into your argument? Like, do we know, for example, if like these are young women who are blacked up playing these roles? Yeah, I'm just wondering how like the bodies of performers themselves factors into your claims.
Right. Thank you for the question. We don't, unfortunately. I mean, there's so limited information. We have like a lot of this is based on conjecture. The argument is based on what the architectural space affords in terms of performance. But in terms of who was actually performing it, who was playing these characters or roles, we have absolutely no at least extant evidence. Most of it comes from playbills. Most of it comes from these, and all the information on the playbills is very scant as well. It's not very detailed, and just very rudimentary sort of descriptions of what's happening in these scenes, in these parts. Like I said, these weren't. They didn't require to submit any script to the examiner of plays, which is one of the crucial records that we have of performances that survived. Astley's was not required to do that. So we don't really have that sort of information. But when it comes to the representation of racial bodies, I think the point is that, we have to think about, these were white actors to some extent playing blacked up roles or brown, sort of putting a pigment in some form or the other. They were mediated and racialized. And the point that I'm making is not that these representations were empowering by any stretch of the imagination, but that what these performances introduce is a kind of instability in otherwise rigid colonial binaries. That was, I think, the main point that I was trying to get at.
Any other questions? If people are thinking, I've got a sort of slightly broader question about the sort of staging, Astley, because one of the sort of the ways that you were talking about it made me think about early sort of cinema and the screening of newsreels and those sorts of things. So I was wondering whether that's one of the functions that Astley was performing in this period, because you talk about it as theatrical performance, which it definitely is, but it's also got like a kind of weird series of documentary claims going on in those these are like key moments, and the reproduction of the festival I thought was particularly interesting. I don't know a great deal about the performances of Astley's, but I've encountered it mainly as being early on in the microcosm of London, so just the visual representation. But just can you give us a kind of sense of what the performances there are doing? They're definitely doing spectacle, but are they also, and I think you brought out the affective functions and the ways that the space sort of controls or fails to control those really well. But is this being seen by the audience as purely spectacle, or also reportage, or what else is going on there?
I mean, absolutely. This is pure spectacle. I mean, firstly, and what adds to the spectacle is this claim to authenticity as well. Astley, at least Astley Senior, had an establishment in Paris as well. And a lot of the interesting claims that he was making in the playbills is that we've got authentic, sort of descriptions of the scenes and through our paintings of Seringapatam, of the city and everything, directly from Paris. And all of the playbills, that's the claim that he mentions, that, this is directly coming from Paris, from my acquaintance. Almost, and interesting why Paris is mentioned is because there's this interesting connection between Napoleon and Tipu as well. There's a supposed letter being exchanged between them, Tipu asking for Napoleon to help out with forces against the British, Napoleon going to Egypt in the hope of ending up in India to help out Tipu. So, and then there are French forces in India helping them out. So this claim to, I know a person in Paris who's given me details about what the city, what the siege was like, or what the city was like, what the costumes, what sort of costumes were worn by Tipu soldiers. There's definitely a claim to authenticity, but that doesn't, I think, betray the idea that this is pure entertainment. It is pure spectacle. But in the way I'm reading it, is spectacle is never just empty entertainment. It is a technique of ideology. It is one that naturalizes dominance through affective pleasures. It is when war becomes a circus. The violence of empire is reframed as a thrilling performance. And what I was trying to show is how this seemingly frivolous entertainment functioned like a sensory pedagogy of imperial identification, how to position yourself when you're hearing this news of the war happening in the colonies. In other words, exoticism, militarism, and emotion are sort of fused together in popular consciousness in Astley's, and that's what I find fascinating about it.
Yeah, I really liked your discussion of the three-act structure as well, where the third act is sort of designed to potentially sort of recontrol emotions that might have been allowed to sort of run in contrary directions in the first act. So I think that sort of because I guess that sort of packaging of news and events into a neat succession of scenes, or a succession of scenes where the possibility of running wild in the first two scenes is foreclosed by the third. We've got a number of people who have to, I think, leave on the hour, but expressing their thanks. Rosalind, did you have a question?
Yes, but it's a totally selfish one. Only because I'm interested for my postdoc in sense of perspective, and I have real trouble thinking about it in terms of the theatre. So how do you construct the view from a height in the theatre? And it struck me that Astley's might be the kind of space where you can effectively do that in a different way to other shapes of spaces. So I was wondering if you could speak to that. But again, I realize this is really off topic.
What do you mean by height? Could just
So mountainscapes, views from hills, the kind of classic romantic sublime, if you like.
Right.
In poetry, it looks a certain way. In prose, it looks slightly different. Theatre, I'm out of my depth, is what I'm telling you. So perhaps if you had any ideas, I'd be interesting to hear.
There's a lot of visual techniques. Firstly, if I just focus specifically on Astley's, there is most of the interior architecture of Astley's, apart from the visual material that I showed displayed in my presentation. There was one unique newspaper clipping which describes the interiors because it was burnt down. So it's describing, okay, where the horse shed, where the horses were kept, where the music room is. So that sort of allows us to reconstruct the height in a way of the stage, because the stage was basically the roof of the horse shed. You can enter the horse shed from the outside, and the stage, the ground, the platform of the stage was basically the roof of the horse shed. That is why you require a sloping platform, because the ring is a little more below ground. And I think that is what, when you're looking at the Battle of Alma, there is this visual height being displayed in that image. And I think that if we can sort of speculate that that is the sort of, that is the way it was sort of performed, that, you know, the heights, the sloping Alma. And similarly, if you're going to siege a fortress, you would imagine, because you need a backdrop to paint the fortress. So you would imagine the fortress has to be on the stage, even though it's not explicitly mentioned, but there is a backdrop which needs to be put up on the stage through all of these mechanisms. Then it's the painting itself, the scenic paintings that we have, the deployment of perspective two vanishing points, which creates, you know, artificial depth, foreshortening, all of the things that a cubical stage was known for. That has become quite advanced by this time, that sort of technology, that sort of skill in representing depth, height. So I think it does can be, how do you say, simulated, or we can imagine how it was simulated within a theatrical environment based on just these tangential pieces of evidence. Yeah.
You've got a question from Daniel, another question. I just want to quickly follow up on that question, because I think there's an interesting thing about, I just wanted to ask about sort of whether Astley's has the kind of ticket hierarchy that's similar to the patent theatre. So do you get the effect of height or some of these perceptual effects better if you're sitting down the bottom in the more expensive seats than if you're sitting at the top? Or is that not how pricing and structuring works in Astley's at all?
I think it's the opposite. I think the seats which have the worst view are more expensive. I might be wrong, but I think that's what I remember, because the royalty was never seated with the commoners, and royalty did visit these establishments as well. They were seated in boxes, but from the boxes, you're always getting a very partial view of the stage. And so I think the seating arrangement was actually the opposite, in terms of what we would consider now of more value, to have a better view of the stage. Yeah, so but there is a hierarchy, definitely, in the ticketing prices.
Yes, I guess in some ways you're carrying across some of the abilities, the stuff from the patent theatres where the boxes are close to the stage, but those are more social environments, whereas here you are getting a bad view of the spectacle in some ways for your social. That's interesting. Daniel, do you want to appear and give your question?
Thank you very much indeed. Sorry, I seem to have video. I think
you're breaking up a bit.
Just wanted to say, firstly, thanks very much for a fascinating talk, Yasser. Found that really amazing, very interesting, very well theorized. I was really interested in the comparison, very briefly, which came out between Ireland and India as colonial spaces in your talk. And I was wondering, I think this is a question from ignorance, but I believe there was an Astley's in Dublin, and I was wondering about whether it would have, taken on the same exhibitions. Would the exhibitions have moved from London to Dublin? And what would the colonial space in Dublin itself result in different kinds of readings of similar scenes? I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, but I thought that connection or comparison was very interesting.
Thank you so much. I did try and find if there were, I sort of went into as much as I could find where these performances were being done, Paris and Dublin and in London. Unfortunately, I couldn't really find that sort of evidence of performances in Dublin. But I would, I would like to say that they are different in terms of if one, I didn't get an opportunity to explore the performances in Dublin. So I can't really say much to that, but this, in terms of this connection between the triangular connection between Bagshot Heath, Ireland, and India, to me, it's not unique to just this day's playbill. It's repeated again and again, even in 1790. And this is something which Daniel O'Quinn has pointed out as well, in terms of during the Tipu performances, there were these songs. A lot of the positions of these songs were made by Irish soldiers or people who typified Irish soldiers. So why is an Irish soldier singing a song about the Tipu sort of military engagement, glorifying, again, a sort of identity with British Empire and its imperial project, and against this other? So, and this is during a very interesting time. I mean, 1790s was a turbulent period in Irish history. You have Wolfe Tone emerging, you have the Irishmen, United Irishmen emerging, and by 1798 you have a full-blown rebellion coming into place. So this voicing of the Irish soldier in connection with the imperial project is very interesting, and at least in terms of how it is portrayed on the domestic front. And that is what the triangular connection that I was trying to draw, that even though these are two colonial projects, yet they have very different relationships in the imaginary. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? We've got one from Shavira in the chat. I'll read this out, but do unmute and speak if you'd like to elaborate at all. So the question here is, you mentioned this was a work in progress. Do you have a sense of what directions you're continuing to take this research, or other avenues of inquiry or research you're pursuing? So is this part of a project that you've sort of now concluded, or is this part of a broader project on imperial spectacle?
I think it's something which I'm just scratching the surface, to be honest. I mean, in terms of I feel like I feel like it's a new way of engaging with the archives, because I mean, none of the claims that I'm making are about how the audiences experience this. Like, it's not an empirical claim that I'm making. It's more about highlighting how the structure of the performance, the design of the space, the emotional cues built into the scenography sort of worked to invite certain kinds of affective alignment. Now, empirically, that might have been the case, that might not have been the case. It's more about a spectrum of possibilities that are opened up when we start engaging with sensation, affect, emotion. In other words, what are the structural affordances that a performance space offers? In other words, it's a parallel, how do you say, affective architecture that I'm constructing upon the space itself. So I feel like it's offering me a very new way to engage with the archives, and where this project is heading. One, I've tried to engage. I have no skills with digital tech and 3D modeling, so I've tried to engage with people who have those skills, like a lot of the models being made here. And they were, in a way, I'm not using them as proofs, but as provocations to think about performance. And this is something which I experienced while reading Shakespeare as well. We are so tuned to reading Shakespeare rather than seeing or thinking of Shakespeare as a performance, that we often don't think about where are these bodies coming into or exiting, who is holding what sort of background imagery. So, in terms of, and I'm sure there's a lot of Shakespeare performance scholarship as well, but that's not the way we were taught in school, for example, or when we were doing our degrees. But suddenly when you start thinking of Shakespeare from a performative angle, it suddenly becomes very rich. The questions become very different. So, and I think that these tools that we are having, these 3D modeling tools, AI technology, I did the whole visualization of what it might look like from the stage of Astley's. They are suggestive visualizations. They are interpretive aids. And I think that way, re-looking at the archives can offer and open up new ways of engaging with the material in very sort of innovative ways. I am going to be presenting an extension of this connected to imperial botany, for example, the plants on stage, how plants were depicted on stage for the MLA next year. A little advertisement of that, but that is something that I will be looking into, how plants and sort of these images were staged in alignment with Kew Gardens exhibitions. So how imperial plants were suddenly brought onto the stage, what sort of how they became shorthand for empire, like sugar canes for slave economies, palm trees for tropical environments. So suddenly you have a lot of material which is there, but we don't know how to think about it. We don't know how to sort of, we don't have a language to make it legible or interpret it. And I think it suddenly becomes a very new space, new way to engage with the material.
Yeah, no, I think that's super interesting. Yes, when it is said exit pursued by a bear, where is the bear coming from and what sort of directions? And I really like that material that you were talking about at the end there, thinking about how a kind of integrated London cultural scene stages the same things in different places, or kind of tries to sort of create or draws on things that are sensations in other locations. I mean, there's sort of the many pirate productions of Pierce Egan's Life in London, I guess, is a later kind of version of that phenomenon. But the idea that there are certain things that are certain kinds of news that are current at a time, and those are staged across a whole series of spaces in material culture through the movements of bodies, as well as through the kinds of textual evidence that are more immediately available, seems like a really interesting direction. Does anyone have any final questions? I'll give you a couple more moments in case you're still formulating. If not, then can we thank Yasser again for a really fascinating and rich presentation. I thought that was that was fabulous. Well done. It's a really brilliant, like, kind of sort of imaginative, but also deeply evidenced and well researched reconstruction of the ways that these sort of neglected because they're less recorded theatrical spaces might have functioned in all sorts of interesting ways. Yeah, fascinating, compelling, provocative. I completely agree with what's being said in the chat. This is part of a series of digital things that BARS is doing over the summer. Rosalind, do you want to mention other stuff that's coming up?
Have a couple of digital symposia scheduled for a few months' time, so it would be lovely to see more of you attending those, and we will circulate some further information through the mailing list, and certainly the Eventbrite page will be very busy in the next few months, so do check it out and see if there's anything that you'd like to join. You'd all be very welcome. And thank you, Yasser, for being a wonderful start to our 2025 season.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
We've got the call for papers for expanding queer romanticisms is out on the BARS blog at the moment. So if you're doing any work in that area, then do consider submitting. It's 10-minute presentations, so not enormously burdensome. And there's a second symposium we'll be organising. The call for that should be out in the next few days, I hope. But can I thank Yasser again, and thank you all for coming on a sunny or snowy afternoon, depending on where you are. I hope you'll agree, a really rewarding talk to attend. Thanks, everyone.